The recent successful submission of 546,002 signatures for the Let's Go Washington's Washington State Initiative 2066 last week, which is to repeal the stupid natural gas ban efforts of the Democrats in the state legislature. It wasn't a state record, but it was the second largest number of signatures ever submitted for any initiative, according to the Washington State Secretary of State's published statistics. In fact, only the 1973 signature drive to repeal pay raises that were basically voted on by elected officials at the time received more when back then they submitted 699,000 signatures in just a few weeks, and that was 51 years ago. So this recent effort was also the first initiative to beat Tim Iman's first successful $30 car tab effort from 1999, when he actually had submitted 514,000 signatures back then. Now, just regardless of the record books and the bragging rights for the number of signatures submitted, I believe that there's actually far more to this story than meets the eye, than just what is likely to be reported in what's left of the mainstream kind of government-approved media. So let's look into the successful initiative effort a bit deeper, and then maybe we can get a better understanding of the ramifications for our state and public policy moving forward. Now, before we do that, I want to encourage you to hit the like button and subscribe button down below. And I know that roughly half the people watching this video, you're probably not subscribed, but it really does help our channel's visibility if you just go ahead and hit that subscribe button and even share this video with some others who might appreciate our videos and the content that we provide. It's sure to annoy our political leadership class and their cronies, of course, and it costs you really nothing but a few seconds to do so. Now, back to the successful Washington State Initiative drive I-2066 to repeal the natural gas ban effort. The origins of the story actually begin with a corrupt idea that was cooked up by political elite insiders and grifters who believe that natural gas is evil, and there is great money to be made by banning it. And this is really an entire environmental cartel that's been structured and organized with just a laser focus on making life just more miserable and certainly more costly for you and I and pretty much anybody who's a regular person, making it harder and more expensive for us to live. Now, you know the type. These are the climate crazies who claim that the world will end tomorrow unless we all live in cedar bark homes and eat tofu every day. You know, these are the same people actually who cause traffic jams on I-5 with stupid protests by their paid minions, and then they, of course, fly on private jets to Davos or other exotic locations to conjure up more ways to steal your life energy away and then make the world a worse place than it ever was before. All, of course, to benefit themselves and their insider wealthy cronies, while they virtue signal their superiority of the rest of us, very ignorant peasants that we are. And of course, these jet-setting grant grifters, they need politicians to do the dirty work at some point. And the dirtiest politicians are usually Democrats who are happy to go along with the scam. And this is really what happened this year in the Washington State Legislature when they passed HB 1589, which was passed earlier this year at 2 a.m. with a stupid emergency clause, of course, that was attached to it so the people could not run a referendum to repeal the bill. And it did take some very last-minute threats from Governor Jay Inslee and others on the handful, basically pressuring the handful of reluctant Democrats who know darn well that this was just a stupid idea. And the bill had been watered down from its original monstrosity, but everyone recognized that it was the beginning of a plan to ban natural gas as an energy source in Washington State. And they started kind of down this dumb anti-consumer path by bribing Puget Sound Energy in the bill with kind of this get-out-of-jail-free card at the UTC, which is the Utility Transportation Commission, so that they could simply just raise rates on consumers to pay for this virtue signaling effort. Now, the Evergreen State College campus and viral crazies, of course, they praised the secretive 2 a.m. bill, and the elitists celebrated the opportunity to increase the cost of living for the peasants that are out there in one more way, while setting the state up for more state-sponsored grafting and grifting scams for potential insiders in the future. Now, this is how you make the gravy train. However, the rest of us peasants and peons who actually live in the real world were not so happy with this dumb public policy, not at all. Now remember, this was essentially an offshoot of a similar dumb Biden administration idea from last year, but Washington State was one of the few states, not the only one, but it was one of the very few that had a political crew that was corrupt and stupid enough to actually move in that direction after the feds backed off of this similar unpopular plan when it received such national widespread anger and mockery at the time. I mean, every dumb idea conceived in D.C. needs suckers and lemmings willing to test the waters, and the Washington state legislature has plenty of those who are led by retiring Governor Inslee and, of course, wannabe governor and current AG Bob Ferguson. Now, to be fair, New York State did jump slightly ahead of Washington State on this crazy train. And this is essentially now the background that led to a consortium of groups, led mostly by the BIW, which is the Building Industry Association of Washington State and the Washington Hospitality Association, and a variety of smaller donors. They raised a few $1 million to fund an initiative to the people, which had a deadline of July 5th, by which they actually needed to submit at least 324,516 valid signatures. Now, there was only one logical group that they could team up with to make this happen in such a short time. And that, of course, was obviously just the Let's Go Washington team, which had been launched, funded, headed, and managed by Brian Heywood, and which had just successfully submitted 6 initiatives to the legislature in December, each of which usually had more than about 100,000 extra signatures on them for each initiative, just to be safe. Now, while Brian put in his own money to make that effort happen last year, he also demonstrated a cost efficiency per initiative that was vastly superior to any of the kind of rip-off scams that the consultant class had been peddling in recent years. He essentially was successful with 6 initiatives for about the same price of one, which the consultant class was typically had quoted in the past. Now, the Let's Go Washington folk and their allies in the fight to repeal the state's absurd effort to ban natural gas had a very successful low-key submission of 431,000 plus signatures to the Secretary of State's office on Tuesday afternoon last week, July 2nd. And then, of course, later in this week for I-2066, the initiative which was to protect energy sources in Washington state and, of course, stop the state's natural gas ban effort. This by itself was far more than the 324,000 and change that they needed. However, just to be thorough and probably just to send a message, they appear to have submitted just another batch before the deadline ended at 5 p.m. on July 5th, last Friday, which brought the total up to the 546,002, which I mentioned earlier, and that's 220,000 more signatures than they actually needed, which gets them placed now second on the all-time state record, according to the Secretary of State's own numbers. Now, this is also fairly impressive because this was done in less than 50 days, which is not easy. The Let's Go Washington people and their supporters made it look easy, but it really is not easy at all. Now, since this initiative, just like the previous successful submission of 6 initiatives 8 months ago, they're not favorites of the basically left-leaning establishment or the bloated bureaucratic state. And because of this, you're not going to find a lot of media coverage of this whole event. What coverage you do find will be obligatory, and it's going to be basically newsworthy after all, even for our partisan news organizations that largely see themselves as defenders of the current political establishment in Washington state. And sometimes they just still must pretend to be journalists rather than propagandists. But this success has largely been understated, and I believe it's been muted so far. Now, to be fair to the media, part of this understatement is also due to the political obsession with the recent fallout from the presidential debate from the week before, where Biden's mental capacity became impossible to deny anymore. And partly this is also the fact that so many people were enjoying the July 4th holiday. However, don't expect the traditional media to cover the story regardless, because it doesn't fit the chosen narrative of the political class in our state today. Political insiders, they're not happy with this outcome right now. However, I suspect that there's far more to the story that is widely ignored, and it should be discussed, at least by those of us who care about the wonkish side of the public policy process. And of course, by those of us who attempt to observe and report on the changing direction in the political tides in our state. It is far bigger, I think, than most people realize. At least I haven't seen it reported in much detail yet, so the recent phenomenon of initiatives to fix what is broken in Washington state that was launched by Let's Go Washington, sponsored by Brian Heywood, I think this is a bigger deal than most political observers they tend to realize right now, or have admitted. I really do. Something has changed in Washington state, and the political establishment just seemed determined to pretend that it hasn't. Now, obviously, the history of the initiative process in Washington state is, by its very nature, it's an act of rebellion against the state and the established political order. And this has been true since Washington's Constitution was amended in 1912 to allow the initiative process in the first place. This only makes sense because special interests who have a vice grip on the political class, they don't really need initiatives when they control the governor and the majority party in the legislature. It's really only when the people who are left out of the political process and abused by the ruling majority, when they feel ignored and trampled, then the initiative process is used as an outlet for their efforts and frustration. Now, frequently, the initiative process has been used to push back against unfair taxes imposed by the ruling class, and this has actually been done repeatedly. In 1922, the voters repealed the unpopular poll tax with Initiative 40. From 1932 to 1938, the voters actually repeatedly passed tax reduction initiatives that were related to property taxes. They did that 4 times in a row every year. This usually was led and organized by farmers at the time. And this really finally led to the legislature changing the state constitution to make it harder to raise property taxes and to limit them a bit. In 1972, the voters approved an initiative to the legislature, I-44, to limit property taxes once again. In 1977, the voters approved Initiative 345, which exempted food from sales tax. In 1979, the voters also approved an initiative to the legislature, which is I-62, which attempted to limit the growth of government. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? In 1981, the voters approved Initiative 402 to abolish inheritance taxes. In 1993, Washington voters actually approved Initiative 601, which intended to put limits on taxes and expenditure increases. And all of this happened long before the Democrat Party knew that Tim Iman even existed. Now, when Tim Iman got involved, he recognized the people's general disgust with how government arrogantly wastes their tax dollars and always wants more. So his initiative that most famously focused on reducing the cost of car tabs, starting in 1999 with Initiative 695, and again in 2002 with Initiative 776, and finally in his last hurrah in 2019 with Initiative 976. There was also the times that he focused on property tax, and particularly when he held the growth of property tax to 1% with Initiative I-747 in 2001, only after a successful Initiative 722 at the time, which was to hold them at 2%. And in 2002, of course, the voters also approved a referendum to repeal a stupid unemployment tax. That was R-53. Not an Iman one, but this one was sponsored by BIW at the time. In 2007, the voters approved a supermajority vote in the legislature to increase taxes with I-960. In 2010, the voters approved an industry-sponsored effort to repeal a soda and candy tax, and also an Iman-sponsored effort to restore a 2/3 requirement in the legislature to raise taxes once again. Initiative 1185 in 2012 was again approved to restore a 2/3 requirement to raise taxes. And once again in 2015, Iman made another successful effort to restore the 2/3 requirement to raise taxes with a constitutional amendment backdoor option. Then another industry-sponsored effort to repeal a Democrat-supported grocery tax was successful in 2018 with I-1634. Iman's last initiative, as I mentioned earlier, to restore $30 car tabs was in 2019. That was the final effort during the Iman era before AG Bob Ferguson was finally successful with his lawfare campaign to bankrupt and destroy Tim Iman. He was obviously a pain in the rear end for the Democrats. Now, obviously, during the last 100 years, there were many other citizen initiatives during this time that succeeded, including the first one to ban alcohol statewide in 1914. That one didn't last too long. Maybe ban animal trapping later on in the 90s, and just random cultural fights over the years. But the theme of reducing taxes and the size of government has really remained a common effort by the people in Washington state in our effort to rebel and push back against an always arrogant and always out-of-touch governing class. Now, usually the legislature, the bureaucracy, and the grifters who feed on their largesse, they're going to always try to find loopholes. They find tame judges and other paths to extract the cash that they wanted to get from the peasants. But the initiative process has served well in Washington state, not perfectly, but certainly as roadblocks, and at least adequately over a century in providing an option for people who are ignored by the political elite and out-of-touch arrogance that always comes to personify a fossilized government class that just can't be bothered to restrain any of its worst impulses. Which actually brings us to the current Let's Go Washington effort that's sponsored by Brian Heywood. Now, the current inevitable manifestation of this frustration by the people with an arrogant, out-of-touch bureaucracy for whom there will never be enough money to distribute to their corrupt friends, and of course the special interests in exchange for just perpetual political power and control. the peasants and the peons in the state, like you and I, will always be ignored and gaslit when necessary. So the tamed and approved media, they're always going to help the political elite sell their historic failures and corruption as a good thing. And then just the price of doing business. It's just modern government. The difference, I believe, between today and the historic efforts of the past is really essentially one of an order of magnitude and frustration. In an increasingly censored world, the path to fix what is broken in government just must adapt to the size and corruption of those who seem intent on breaking everything except their own grip on power, and of course the taxpayer cash they desire to maintain that same grip on power. Now, the Grange may have been distributing initiative signature sheets from town to town via Model T Fords back in the 1930s. A disgruntled furniture salesman from Linwood collected nearly 700,000 signatures in just a few weeks in the 1970s to repeal a pay raise for the legislature, that they, of course, had voted for themselves. Without cell phones, without email, without the internet or social media, Tim Iman was able to spot a clear desire and frustration on the part of just regular people with just the arrogant politicians and bureaucrats. And he was remarkably successful in a quirky, eccentric way, using every trick in the book, including gorilla suits, Darth Vader costumes, and a relentlessly hostile battle with the media. Now, a lazy Seattle Times reporter has called Brian Heywood Tim Iman with a bank account. And this was a partisan, convenient quote made to order for the billionaire now who funds the pro-tax effort and the attack ads on Brian Heywood that we see right now everywhere in the media. Hopefully the lazy left and their billionaire supporters think that this is all he is. But it took Iman 8 years to get as many initiatives across the finish line as the Let's Go Washington crew has managed in less than a year. Now, this is something I think very different now. And the opportunity for regular people in Washington state to use the initiative process once again to push back on the corrupt and stupid things that are done in Olympia, it actually seems more possible now than ever before, especially with the ability to run multiple initiatives at the same time. Now, Brian Heywood really appears to be the anti-Iman. I mean, Tim Iman was a guy selling watches from his condo when he started collecting signatures for initiatives back in the day. He eventually found a way to make a living for a few years running initiatives. He wore bright t-shirts and he had crazy press conferences and pies thrown in his face. However, it's obvious that Brian Heywood will never get personal benefit to even come close to the money that he's already put into the successful and even his previously unsuccessful initiative efforts. It's hard to see how Brian Heywood can even break even on this effort. And I mean, we have seen deep pockets in the past fund an initiative here and there. But never have we actually seen a businessman step into the muck and the mess of this process and organize, direct, and manage a system to do it so efficiently, repeatedly, over and over again now. Now remember, in order to do this, he had to step on the toes of a lot of Republican consultants to do this. And while he uses paid signature gatherers as part of the program, it is obvious, based on the volume of signatures recently gathered, that the Let's Go Washington crew has developed a robust volunteer program capable of collecting a lot more than just 150,000 signatures without paid gatherers. And that's how you can actually submit 546,000 signatures in just 45 days. The real difference with past deep pocket donors is that Heywood is clearly hands-on in the organizing and structure of this process. He's not just sitting back and tossing checks at consultants, hoping they don't run off with his money. Now, based on the interviews I've seen Brian Heywood give with many local and national reporters, he's very friendly, he's focused and knowledgeable about the need to fix what is broken in Washington state. And his business background probably appears to have been a good primer and experience for him to understand how to do this more efficiently than others. Even when the reporters are nasty and call him names, he just continues to keep moving forward. I don't think you're going to see Brian dressing up in a gorilla costume or Darth Vader outfit to promote the initiatives. He frequently reports the actual number of signatures they have collected midstream, which is really counter to what is typically done in this business. And he did that recently, even during the I-2066 effort, which caused a bunch of lefty reporters to claim that the effort was failing because they clearly hadn't collected enough signatures to be on track, just a few weeks before they avalanched the Secretary of State's office with far more signatures than were needed to qualify. Now, I've interviewed Brian Heywood multiple times in the past, and you can see those interviews down below. And I believe that you can decide for yourself who Brian Heywood is and why he has taken the extreme risk of spending his own money, putting a target on his back for the political class and the billionaires who own them to harass and disparage him, just as they're currently doing in their pro-tax campaigns. But the interviews that I had were actually before he was successful with these initiatives. I think they're really illustrate who he is if you go back and look at him. Some of them were after his first effort had failed. Now, this is November, and coming up in November, the first 4 votes every Washingtonian can check on their ballots will be these 4 initiatives. And these are even before the president, with all the confusion on the Democrat side who that's going to be right now. These initiatives have an easy campaign slogan to remember: vote yes, pay less. And I believe most regular people can both understand that and easily be willing to support that effort, even if the billionaire class and bureaucrats claim that the world will end if you don't give them more of your money. Now, regardless of your political affiliation or red team, blue team, basically a cheer squad, these are easy decisions for most people. This scenario has only been made possible, however, by one guy willing to show up and, of course, to risk a lot of his own money, time, and obviously weather the storm of billionaire-funded attack ads. And even for those people who hate politicians, Brian has actually given them now a reason to vote in November. Now, as I end this video, I know a bunch of people watching right now were involved in helping gather signatures, not just this last month, but also in the previous initiatives last year. It's your efforts that helped us get here as well, I think. Brian Heywood provided the opportunity for us to see something successful that nobody expected to see a year ago. And this has made a real impact. We don't all have the skills or resources like Brian to achieve something like this, but there are reasonable projects and goals that we can all set for ourselves to have an impact in our community to fix what is broken where we live. And I challenge you to identify something near you, a problem that needs to be solved, a scandal that needs to be exposed, a solution that nobody's considered before. Find your task and show up to make an impact. Because, as I always say, the future belongs to those who show up.